talk about how games function as third places, especially for American youth. Now, the games I'm going to talk about right now are massively multiplayer online games, which are games played on servers where people play together in a collaborative or competitive way in the game itself. But the argument applies to all games with any kind of fandom within it. But massively multiplayer online games, or MMOGs, are the games that I've studied the most of. So I'll use my own work as examples. So in order to understand how a game community would function as a new third place, we really have to step back a bit and understand something about American culture, civic engagement, and some of the arguments and empirical findings that have been made over the last decade or two of work in America. Putnam argued what he called the bowling alone hypothesis. One of his claims, of many, was that media, including media like games, are displacing crucial civic and social institutions. And he made a fairly compelling empirical argument about the decline, for example, of trust in the United States across decades, and that civic involvement has in fact tanked. And part of his argument was that media like television, video games, and other kind of pastimes were in fact part of the reason for this kind of dwindling civic engagement across our country. Now, a second author, Oldenburg, talked about something called the third place, which is a concept I want to use here. Now, this notion of third place is juxtaposed against the idea of a first or second place, the first being home, the second being work. So the third place would be a space that's neither work nor home, where you're actually able to engage informally and socially and have some form of identity that is not necessarily so dramatically entailed and encumbered by your identity at home, say as a mother or a father, or your identity at work, whatever that may be. And in Oldenburg's sociological treatise, in his book, he writes about how third places are the people's own remedy for stress, loneliness, and alienation. And how it is that in America in particular, we structured our cities so that you worked in the center of city, and then you had suburbs outside of the cities around them in a ring city where people would work. Oftentimes those suburbs were even divided in terms of the size of homes. So you might even have instances where, my own family did this, where you have your children of a certain age, you're in a particular size house. As your kids grow, you move homes again. You end up driving from where you live, you drive downtown to work. In America, we often drive to another place to do sort of big box shopping in places like Target or Walmart or any of those kinds of stores. And you end up with this very sort of divided lifestyle where you spend a lot of times in cars, and you don't see necessarily mixed-use spaces as you would see in older areas of Manhattan, where people are actually able to hang out in a coffee shop, a bistro, a bookstore, in their neighborhood with people that they might not otherwise run into. Of course, on top of that, you have this sort of efficiency in the workplace that created environments in which we kind of work in cubicles with very sort of repetitive tasks. And of course, classrooms that are so focused again on efficiency and industry, with students sitting in rows, facing forward to a teacher who is there to bequeath and display and download knowledge. Now, Oldenburg's whole notion was that media, again, were part of the problem of the lack of third places. And he argued that the home entertainment industry thrives in the dearth of the informal public life among the American middle class. Demand for all manner of electronic gadgetry to substitute vicarious watching and listening for more direct involvement is high. I want to argue instead that the ways in which youth are using online spaces like massively multiplayer online games and the online communities around games is in fact the new third place. So one way you might argue that is that if you take the characteristics of a third place that Oldenburg expounds in his book, there are 8 significant characteristics of what makes or constitutes a third place. I'd like to go through and talk about these in relationship to game culture and game communities. So, number 1, it's a neutral ground. A third place by definition is one where folks who attend there and socialize are simply not obligated in any way. They're not obligated legally, financially, politically, or in terms of family and friends.
Obviously, games are an easy match to this particular characteristic. Games are, by their very nature, volunteer.
Number 2, they're levelers. So in the words of J.C. Hertz, it didn't matter what you drove to the arcade. If you sucked at asteroids, you just sucked. Game spaces are ones in which, in fact, it's a great leveler in terms of the extent to which you are valued in that community. The status that you have in a community is based on what you can do, not how rich you are or how pretty. Number 3, conversation is the main activity. Well, in something like an MMO, if you ask participants why they go back to the games that they play again and again, you end up with comments like these from one of my informants from an early study who wrote, "Lineage? It's just a souped-up form of instant messenger." That one of the primary things that you're doing in a game space is socializing, conversation. Number 4, third places are accessible and accommodating. Well, in an MMO world, barring server outages, they are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you can't sleep at 4 a.m., you can get online, and inevitably there will be other people playing with you. 5th, there's a notion of the regulars. Now, in an online space, those regulars are typically the people that you see on your server and, in fact, in your clan. That group, that social setting of a guild, a clan, or other sort of social banding together on an MMO, in fact, constitutes the regulars in your environment, and 78% of players in an MMO actually join such a social sort of environment. So are there regulars in an MMO? Absolutely, yes. 7, a low profile. Now, Oldenburg wrote about third places as being characteristically homely. If you take a look at some of the fantastical settings and environments and costuming of online games, something like Lineage 2 or World of Warcraft, it's hard to think of them as homely. But if you think for a minute about what happens to a typical title that hits the market, there's usually a huge influx of population where the population rises, and then eventually, as new titles come out, the population dwindles some to some sort of plateau. I would argue that once you end up past that parabolic curve where the population has dwindled some, the game, even if it still has beautiful graphics and very fanciful displays of armor and settings, is usually considered somewhat homely and antiquated. So the players that stick around to hang out on something like a Lineage 2 or a World of Warcraft or an earlier build, that environment ends up taking on some characteristics of it being considered more or less fancy than an updated game. 7, the mood is playful. That hardly needs arguing in a space like a gameplay, but you can just take, for example, look at the fandom sort of traffic, fiction, artwork, etc. You find that a sense of humor and playfulness is riddled throughout game community. And finally, characteristic number 8 of a third place is this notion of a home away from home. Now, it's a little bit hard to define what Oldenburg actually meant by this, but we can go back to Saman's 1979 definitions that include 5 defining traits of a home: rootedness, feeling of possession, spiritual regeneration, whatever that may be, feeling of being at ease, and warmth. So these 5 are kind of ambiguous and hard for a scholar to typically research, but let me take one of them that I can get a little bit of empirical traction on. This notion of rootedness. For example, I want to show you a post that was made by an informant in an early ethnography whose pseudonym is Sharp-Paw. This is September in 2004. This was when a hurricane was actually blowing through the area, Hurricane Ivan. So Sharp-Paw, a middle schooler in our study, actually posts to his guild's forum, "Guys, I need to explain what's going on and why I haven't been online. As some of you may know, Hurricane Ivan is in the Gulf and it's charging toward my city. I don't want anyone to worry. It's a mandatory evacuation. If I don't come back to Lineage after a while, it probably means something happened to my computer. I have AIM on my cell phone. Please IM me at, etc. I'll see you after the storm." After this was posted within the next 3 hours, there were no less than 32 different posts responding to his explanation for why he would be offline. So when we talk about the notion of rootedness, part of what we may mean is that although the relationships in a third place are not ones that are entangled, there are ones in which if something were to happen to a regular in that community, it would be noticed. In fact, in this particular incident, 3 people actually ended up from the guild, actually ended up contacting that player to make sure that they were okay and to see if there was anything else that they could do. So while in the sort of American imagination, we think about video games as being antisocial or being spaces in which people are avoiding making friends and being social, it turns out the opposite is actually true in many of these spaces. If we look at the 8 main characteristics of a third place, what you end up finding is that surprisingly, MMO worlds and game communities like them actually fill all 8 particular specific characteristics and functions. So in a way, what you end up finding is that this notion of a third place for informal sociability, something like your neighborhood bar or your neighborhood bookstore where you could hang out and make friends with people for whom your status outside of that world does not matter, for whom they would notice whether or not you showed up a day or didn't. What you find is that kids are using spaces like MMOs and other online game communities as the new third place.